"Still nothing on the comms," murmured Captain Henry Miles, his voice low but steady. The younger man knelt beside Paul, his sharp eyes scanning their sector for signs of trouble. "They'll show themselves soon enough," Paul replied, lowering the binoculars. His grizzled face was lined with exhaustion, though his blue eyes retained a flinty determination. "They always lead with the drones." As if summoned by his words, the faint hum of approaching machinery grew louder. A formation of drones emerged over the horizon, their geometric frames shimmering with blue shielding. Behind them, alien infantry marched with eerie precision, their armor gleaming under the pale sunlight. "Lieutenant Brady, report." Paul barked into his handheld radio. "Southern Quadrant holding, sir," came the crackling reply. Lieutenant David Brady's voice carried the calm authority of a man who had seen too much and survived anyway. "We're spread thin, but morale steady for now." Paul glanced at the men and women around him, hardened fighters clad in patched armor, clutching rifles that looked almost archaic compared to the Jorgen's sleek weaponry. They weren't soldiers, not really. They were farmers, engineers, and teachers, forced into uniforms because there was no one else left to fight. "We'll hold this line," Paul said, though the words felt heavier with every repetition. Sergeant Johnny Reeve appeared, a bundle of mortar shells cradled in his arms. "Got the last batch ready, General," he said, his voice rough but tinged with grim humor. "Let's hope these antiques still pack a punch." Paul's lips twitched into something resembling a smile. "They'll do more than that, Sergeant. Get them distributed." Johnny nodded and hurried off, weaving through the makeshift barricades. The mortars, repurposed relics from wars long past, were a gamble Paul wasn't sure would pay off. But they were all humanity had left, simple, brutal, and devastatingly effective in the right hands. Above the battlefield, the Jorgen's command ship loomed like a monolith. Its dark surface seemed to absorb the light around it, casting a chilling shadow over the ruined city. A sudden burst of static crackled through the radios, followed by a voice dripping with disdain. "Humans," the voice sneered, "your resistance is futile. Surrender now, and your deaths will be swift. Persist, and you will suffer the wrath of the Jorgen Dominion." Paul recognized the voice. Commander Valric, the alien general who had orchestrated the destruction of Earth's major cities. "Arrogant bastard," Johnny muttered as he returned to Paul's side. Paul pressed the transmit button on his radio. "This is General Hawthorne. If you're expecting us to roll over and die, you've underestimated humanity. Again." A low chuckle echoed through the static before the connection cut off. Moments later, the drones surged forward, their sleek bodies moving with predatory grace. Behind them, the alien infantry raised their weapons, unleashing a barrage of energy bolts that tore through abandoned vehicles and shattered concrete. "Hold fire," Paul ordered, his voice a calm anchor amid the chaos. He waited, heart pounding, as the drones closed the distance. The tension was palpable, each second stretching into eternity. "Now!" he shouted. The mortars roared to life, their primitive shells arching through the air before slamming into the drones. Explosions ripped through the enemy formation, sending fragments of metal and alien flesh flying. The Jorgen's shimmering shields flickered and failed under the onslaught, unable to adapt to the sheer physical force of the old-world weaponry. "Reload and fire again," Paul commanded. Henry worked quickly, shouting orders to the nearby fighters as they scrambled to reload the mortars. Johnny hefted another shell into place, his movements precise despite the chaos around him. The Jorgen forces hesitated, their rigid advance faltering as their front lines disintegrated. Paul seized a moment, rallying his men. "Push them back. Show them what Earth is made of." The human fighters surged forward, their defiance burning brighter than the alien energy bolts. Paul moved among them, firing his rifle and shouting encouragement. He caught sight of David holding the southern flank, his squad pinned but unyielding under a relentless barrage. "David, fall back to the main line." Paul called out. "Negative, sir," David replied, his voice strained but resolute. We hold here, or they'll overrun the med tents. Paul's chest tightened, but there was no time to argue. The Jorgen were regrouping, their commanders adapting to the unexpected resistance. A fresh wave of drones emerged, larger and more heavily shielded than the first. "Brace yourselves," Paul shouted. The ground shook as the alien command ship unleashed a focused energy strike, obliterating an entire city block. Debris rained down and screams filled the air. Paul threw himself behind cover, shielding his head as the shockwave rolled over him. When he looked up, he saw Johnny lying a few feet away, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Reeve!" Paul crawled to the sergeant's side and shook him. Johnny groaned and opened his eyes, a lopsided grin breaking through the pain. "Still here, General," he rasped. "Gonna take more than that to put me down." Paul helped him to his feet, the two men leaning on each other for support. Around them, the human forces regrouped, their determination unshaken despite the carnage. The Jorgen command ship descended lower, its shadow engulfing the battlefield. From its underbelly, a massive hatch began to open, revealing a weapon unlike anything Paul had seen before. "Paul," Henry said, his voice tight with urgency, "we've got a problem." "I see it," Paul replied, his jaw tightening. The hatch fully opened, and the weapon hummed to life, a sickly green light emanating from its core. "Get the mortars ready," Paul ordered, his voice hard. "If that thing fires, we're done." As his men scrambled to comply, Paul turned his gaze to the sky, his mind racing. They had survived this long by defying the odds, by refusing to bow to an enemy that saw them as little more than insects. But as the alien weapon powered up, he couldn't shake the feeling that their time was running out. The first mortar shell launched, and Paul whispered a silent prayer. Captain Henry Miles entered, a stack of hastily scribbled reports clutched in one hand. "Intel says the Jorgen are moving reinforcements into Sector 3. If they hit us there, it'll fold the line." Paul nodded but didn't look up. "They think they've got us figured out. Arrogance is their weakness." "You're still betting on those mortars," Henry said, his voice tinged with skepticism. "If this doesn't work, we're finished." Before Paul could respond, the tent flap rustled, and Professor Adrian Blackwood stepped in. The historian looked out of place amidst the grim soldiers, his tweed jacket patched with duct tape, and his thick glasses reflecting the glow of the map's overhead light. "It'll work," Adrian said firmly, his British accent cutting through the tension. "The Jorgen's technology is advanced, yes, but their reliance on energy shielding is their Achilles heel. They've evolved to counter precision strikes, not brute force." Henry folded his arms. "And you're sure about this? Old cannons and explosives against an empire that conquered half the galaxy." Adrian's lips twitched into a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Wars aren't always won with the best weapons, Captain. Sometimes they're won with the ones no one sees coming." Paul finally looked up, his gaze shifting between the two men. "We don't have another option. If this fails, we'll go down fighting, but we'll make them bleed for it." The room fell silent, the gravity of the situation pressing down on them. Adrian cleared his throat and gestured to a schematic he had rolled out over the map. "These mortars were originally designed during the mid-20th century," he explained. "Simple, brutal, and, most importantly, mechanical. The Jorgen's energy shields are calibrated to disperse directed energy attacks. Lasers, plasma, anything precise. But these shells? They rely on kinetic impact and explosive force. Their shields can't absorb it fast enough." Henry leaned over the schematic, studying the modifications Adrian and his team had made. The mortars had been retrofitted to fire with greater range and accuracy, their payloads replaced with modern explosive scavenged from dismantled missiles. "How many do we have?" Henry asked. "Not enough," Paul admitted, "but enough to make them think twice." The tent door flung open, and Lieutenant David Brady entered, his face shadowed with exhaustion but lit with an undeniable fire. "General, the first wave of drones is 2 clicks out. Our spotters confirmed it." Paul straightened. "Then we're out of time." Adrian, anything else we need to know? One thing, Adrian said, hesitating. The timing has to be perfect. These shells can punch through their shields, but if they adapt too quickly, we won't get a second chance. Precision is critical. Paul nodded. Understood. Henry, get the teams ready. David, coordinate with the spotters. We hit them hard and fast. The men dispersed, leaving Paul alone with Adrian. For a moment, the general let his guard drop, running a hand through his graying hair. You've put a lot on the line for this, Professor, Paul said quietly. Adrian smiled faintly. Humanity's always been underestimated, General. I don't intend to let them erase us without a fight. Outside, the camp buzzed with frantic activity. Soldiers loaded mortar shells into launchers, while engineers double-checked the equipment. Paul moved among them, offering words of encouragement where he could, though his mind remained focused on the battle ahead. As the first light of dawn broke, the Jorgen drones appeared on the horizon, their sleek frames glinting in the pale sunlight. Behind them, the alien infantry marched in perfect formation, their discipline as unnerving as their technology. Paul stood atop a makeshift barricade, scanning the enemy forces through his binoculars. They moved with the confidence of a predator stalking its prey, unaware of the trap waiting for them. All units, stand by, Paul said into his radio. His voice was calm, steady, the kind of voice that made men believe in impossible odds. The drones advanced, their energy weapons charging with an ominous hum. Paul counted the seconds, each one stretching longer than the last. Wait for it, he murmured, his finger hovering over the radio's transmit button. The first drone into range. Paul's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. Fire! The mortars thundered, their crude shells arcing high into the sky before slamming into the alien formation. Explosions erupted along the enemy line, tearing through the drones and infantry alike. The Jorgen's shimmering shields flickered and failed, overwhelmed by the sheer physical force. Cheers erupted from the human fighters, but Paul raised a hand to silence them. Reload and fire again. Keep the pressure on. Henry and Johnny worked tirelessly, shouting orders and hauling shells into position. Adrian watched from a distance, his expression a mix of triumph and apprehension. The Jorgen hesitated, their advance faltering for the first time. Their commanders barked orders, trying to regroup, but the mortars continued to rain down destruction. Paul watched the chaos unfold, his jaw clenched. They're adapting, he muttered. Sure enough, the second wave of drones moved in, their shields recalibrated to withstand the kinetic impacts. Paul felt a pang of doubt, but he pushed it aside. Switch to the modified payloads, he ordered. Now! The engineers scrambled to adjust the mortars, replacing the shells with experimental charges designed to disrupt Jorgen electronics. The first volley fired, and the effect was immediate. The drone shields collapsed, their systems short-circuiting in midair. The alien infantry began to retreat, their disciplined ranks breaking under the relentless assault. Paul seized the opportunity. Advance, he shouted, leading the charge. The human fighters surged forward, their morale surging as they drove the Jorgen back. Paul moved with them, his rifle blazing, his voice rising above the chaos. By the time the battle ended, the Jorgen forces were in full retreat, their sleek command ship lifting off with an air of wounded pride. The humans stood victorious, battered but unbroken. Paul surveyed the battlefield, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Beside him, Adrian adjusted his glasses, a small smile playing at his lips. Looks like your theory held up, Paul said, his voice tinged with relief. Adrian nodded. For now. But this was just the beginning. Paul didn't need to ask what he meant. The Jorgen wouldn't give up so easily, and their next move would be even more ruthless. Let them come, Paul said, his gaze hardening. We'll be ready. Captain Henry Miles approached, his face streaked with soot and his uniform torn at the shoulder. We've got reports coming in from the eastern sector. Scouts spotted movement. Another wave gearing up, bigger than the last. Paul's jaw tightened. They're testing us. They'll keep sending waves until we break. And if we don't, Henry asked, his voice quieter now, then they'll escalate. Paul's eyes flicked to the sky, where the Jorgen command ship hovered like a vulture circling a dying prey. They won't stop until Earth is nothing but ash. Adrian Blackwood joined them, carrying a data pad that hummed with faint static. His expression was grave. General, I've analyzed the retreat pattern of their infantry. They're regrouping around a central nexus, likely an operational hub for their field units. If we take it out, we might buy ourselves more time. Henry frowned. More time for what? We can't keep fighting like this. We're bleeding resources and people. We don't have to beat them, Adrian replied, his voice sharp with urgency. We just need to force them to rethink their invasion. Show them that Earth isn't worth the effort. Paul studied the map displayed on Adrian's pad. The Nexus was deep within enemy territory, protected by a sprawling network of defenses. A direct assault would be suicide, but a small, skilled team might be able to infiltrate and destroy it. Who do we have left? Paul asked Henry. Henry hesitated before replying. We've got enough for a diversionary force. A small squad could slip through while the main group keeps their attention elsewhere. But it's a long shot. Paul nodded grimly. Long shots are all we've got. Who leads the squad? Adrian asked, though the answer was already written on Paul's face. I'll go, Paul said without hesitation. Henry took a step forward, his expression darkening. General, you can't. I'm not asking for permission, Paul interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. This is our best chance to disrupt their operations, and I'm not sending anyone else to do it. You're in command while I'm gone. Henry's jaw clenched, but he nodded. Understood, sir. As the plan took shape, Paul handpicked the members of his squad. Lieutenant David Brady for his tactical acumen, Sergeant Johnny Reeve for his unshakable resolve, and 2 others from the remaining fighters who had proven themselves under fire. Each man knew the odds, but none hesitated when Paul explained the mission. The journey to the Nexus was fraught with danger. They moved under the cover of darkness, weaving through the skeletal remains of cities reduced to rubble. The Jorgen drones patrolled the skies, their searchlights cutting through the gloom, forcing the squad to freeze in place more than once. Johnny broke the tense silence as they crouched in the shadows of a collapsed skyscraper. You know, General, this reminds me of the old stories my dad used to tell me. Soldiers sneaking behind enemy lines, pulling off impossible missions. Thought they were just fairy tales. Every legend starts somewhere, Paul said quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon. They reached the outskirts of the Nexus just before dawn. The structure loomed ahead, a sprawling complex of alien architecture that pulsed with an eerie green light. Defensive emplacements surrounded it, manned by Jorgen infantry and automated turrets. David knelt beside Paul, his sharp features grim. We'll need a diversion to get inside. Something big enough to draw their attention, but not so big they realize it's a trap. Paul nodded, formulating a plan. Johnny, set up charges along their western perimeter. David, you and I will breach the east gate once the diversion starts. The rest of you, hold position here and cover our escape route. As Johnny prepared the explosives, Paul and David crept closer to the eastern gate. The minutes stretched unbearably long, each one laden with the risk of discovery. Finally, a distant explosion shattered the stillness, and alarms blared as the Jorgen forces scrambled to respond. That's our cue, Paul said, motioning for David to follow. The gate was heavily guarded, but the chaos created by Johnny's diversion gave them just enough cover to slip through. They moved quickly, their weapons at the ready, dispatching the occasional patrol with brutal efficiency. Inside the Nexus, the alien architecture was even more disorienting. The walls pulsed with energy, and the air hummed with an unnatural vibration that set Paul's teeth on edge. This way, Adrian's voice crackled through Paul's earpiece, guiding them remotely from the command post. The course should be straight ahead. They reached the central chamber, a cavernous room dominated by a massive energy conduit. The core pulsed like a heartbeat, its power palpable in the air. "Plant the charges," Paul ordered. David worked quickly, securing the explosives to the conduit while Paul kept watch. The sound of alien footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing louder by the second. "They're on to us," Paul said grimly. David set the final charge and stepped back. "Ready when you are, General." Paul activated the detonator, but didn't press it yet. "We need to get clear first." "Move!" They sprinted back the way they came, dodging energy bolts as Jorgen's soldiers closed in. Paul took point, his rifle barking as he provided cover for David. By the time they reached the extraction point, the rest of the squad was already engaged in a desperate firefight. Johnny was pinned behind a makeshift barricade, his face streaked with blood, but his determination unyielding. "Go, General!" Johnny shouted, firing his rifle at the advancing enemy. Paul hesitated for a split second before nodding. "David, take the others and fall back." "That's an order." David looked like he wanted to argue, but he obeyed, leading the remaining squad members toward the rendezvous point. Paul turned back to Johnny, who was loading his last clip. "You don't have to do this." "Yeah, I do," Johnny said with a wry smile. "Somebody's got to hold the door." Paul clasped Johnny's shoulder, his grip firm. "You're a damn good soldier, Reeve. Just make it count, sir." Paul ran, his heart heavy, as he heard Johnny's defiant battle cries behind him. When he was far enough away, he pressed the detonator. The ground shook as the charges detonated, and a brilliant flash lit up the sky, followed by an otherworldly howl as the Nexus collapsed. As Paul regrouped with the survivors, he couldn't shake the weight of Johnny's sacrifice. They had won a critical victory, but at a cost that gnawed at his soul. Back at the command post, Adrian's face appeared on the screen, pale but resolute. "You did it, General. The Jorgen are pulling back to reassess." Paul nodded, though his expression was grim. "They'll be back, and we'll be ready," Adrian said firmly. Paul looked out at the battered remnants of his forces, his resolve hardening. The cost of freedom was high, but as long as humanity had fighters like Johnny, it was a price worth paying. Paul Hawthorne stood on the battered ridge, overlooking the field where so many sacrifices had been made. The sky above was a bruised purple, streaked with the smoldering remains of Jorgen's ships scattered like broken stars. The victory at the Nexus had bought Earth precious time, but the reprieve was short-lived. The Jorgen had not retreated to lick their wounds. They were retaliating with a fury that would consume everything. Their command ship had repositioned itself directly above the main human encampment, and its massive energy core was charging for what Adrian Blackwood grimly referred to as a planetary purging strike. "How long do we have?" Paul asked as he strode into the command tent, his boots leaving muddy prints on the floor. Adrian was hunched over a terminal. 10 minutes, maybe less. When that core reaches full capacity, it'll release an energy wave capable of wiping out life across half the hemisphere. Paul's eyes narrowed. "Options." "One," Adrian said, his voice taut with tension. "Their ship's core is volatile. If we hit it with enough force, it'll cascade and destroy the entire vessel. But getting close enough..." He trailed off, unwilling to state the obvious. Henry Miles, standing nearby, slammed his fist on the table. "We've got enough men left to mount a desperate push, but we can't afford another suicide mission. There's barely anyone left as it is." Paul's gaze lingered on the map of the battlefield, the Jorgen ship's position marked by a glowing red icon. His mind raced, weighing the risks against the grim reality of inaction. "We don't need an army," he said at last. "Just one strike team with enough firepower to punch through." Henry stared at him in disbelief. "You can't seriously be thinking about going up there yourself again." Paul met Henry's eyes, his expression resolute. "We don't have time for debate. Adrian, can we rig the mortars to fire a concentrated payload strong enough to destabilize the core?" Adrian hesitated. "Theoretically, yes. But someone would have to get inside their defensive perimeter to plant a targeting beacon. Without it, We'd never penetrate their shielding. I'll do it, Paul said without hesitation. Henry stepped forward, his face a mixture of anger and frustration. Damn it, Paul. You're not invincible. You've already given more than anyone could ask for. Let someone else. No one else knows their tactics like I do, Paul interrupted. And no one else has a chance of getting in and out alive. If we fail here, there won't be anyone left to fight back. Henry's jaw worked as if he were chewing over a response, but he finally sighed and gave a reluctant nod. Then I'm coming with you. Paul placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. No, I need you to stay here and lead the defense. If this goes south, you're Earth's last line. Henry's grip tightened into a fist, but he said nothing, his silence a testament to his unwilling agreement. Within minutes, Paul's strike team was assembled. Adrian handed him a beacon the size of a grenade, its sleek design humming faintly with latent power. This is calibrated to lock onto the ship's core, Adrian explained. Once you place it, get out as fast as you can. The mortars will fire automatically, but you'll only have a 2-minute window before impact. Paul nodded, slipping the device into his belt. We've got this. The Jorgen's ship loomed ahead as the strike team approached under cover of darkness, its glowing underside casting an eerie light over the battlefield. Paul led the way, his rifle slung across his back as they moved in silence, each step a calculated risk. When they reached the ship's perimeter, the defenses came to life. Automated turrets swiveled toward them, their crimson beams slicing through the air. Paul shouted orders, his voice cutting through the chaos as his team returned fire. They moved like a well-oiled machine, each man covering the others as they advanced toward the ship's massive hull. Paul's heart pounded in his chest, each second a countdown to the moment he would plant the beacon, or die trying. "Cover me!" he shouted, breaking from the group and sprinting toward the ship. Energy bolts rained down around him, the heat searing his skin as he zigzagged through the onslaught. He reached the base of the ship and ducked into the shadows of its massive landing struts. With trembling hands, he activated the beacon and secured it to the ship's core access panel. The device pulsed with a soft blue light, its signal locking onto the target. "Beacon's live!" Paul called into his radio. "Adrian, fire the mortars." 2 minutes. Adrian's voice crackled back. Paul turned to retreat, but the Jorgen had anticipated his move. A squad of alien infantry descended from the ship, their weapons raised. No escape, their leader hissed in heavily accented English. Paul raised his rifle, knowing the odds were against him. He fired, taking down 2 of the aliens before the others closed in. One knocked the weapon from his hands, and he was forced into brutal hand-to-hand combat. The Jorgen were stronger, faster, but Paul fought with the desperation of a man with everything to lose. His fists and blade found their marks, but every move cost him. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye, and his breathing grew ragged. Suddenly, a flash of light and the sound of a human battle cry erupted behind him. Henry and a small squad had broken through the defenses, their arrival turning the tide. "Thought you could leave me behind?" Henry shouted, cutting down an alien soldier with a spray of gunfire. "Not now, Henry," Paul shouted, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite the dire situation. They fought side by side, carving a path back toward the extraction point as the ship began to hum ominously. The beacon had done its job, and the mortars were en route. 30 seconds, Adrian's voice echoed in their earpieces. Paul and Henry pushed harder, their lungs burning as they sprinted through the chaos. The ship's energy core began to destabilize, its glow intensifying to a blinding white. "Move, move, move," Paul yelled, his voice hoarse. They dove into a trench just as the first mortar struck. The explosion was deafening, a cataclysmic roar that shook the ground and sent shockwaves rippling through the air. The Jorgen ship disintegrated in a cascade of fire and energy, its wreckage raining down like falling stars. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the ragged breathing of the survivors. Paul pulled himself to his feet, his body battered but unbroken. He looked at Henry, who was grinning despite a bloody gash on his cheek. "We did it," Henry said, his voice filled with disbelief and relief. Paul nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the dawn was beginning to break. For now, as the survivors regrouped, Adrian's voice came through the radio, weak but triumphant. "They're retreating. The Jorgen are pulling their forces back." Paul allowed himself a rare moment of relief, though he knew the fight was far from over. Humanity had won this battle, but the war for Earth's survival had only just begun. Paul turned to his men, his voice steady despite the exhaustion weighing him down. "Let's get back. There's work to be done." And as they marched toward the horizon, the light of a new day rising behind them, they carried with them the unshakable resolve that humanity would endure.